Hello, folks. Or assuming anyone is there. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 1, 2. Right. Well, I'll assume no one is here and just get started then, which works fine for me. Alright, so what we're working on today is world building and encounter design specific to Pathfinder, though the basics of this can be applied just about anywhere. I'm going to opt for the encounter building side of things to begin with because, well, I'm using this as an excuse to make sure I work on some of the stuff that I have to prep for the game I run on Fridays. So, here we go. So, for this particular encounter design scenario, I'm going to be working on, or based off of, what the party has done in the past. So, there's some dissonance between this and, hey, let's build a first dungeon or anything of that sort. But again, the principles are what matter here. So, if one is building an encounter, there are lots of artsy, have a good idea type things. Those things can't really be taught. You can learn what makes a good encounter, you can learn what makes an interesting encounter, and that's some of the stuff we'll talk about. But ideas, really it starts with something that looks cool, seems cool to you. Because really the mechanics, at least for Pathfinder and a lot of the systems out there, are robust enough that you can make it work. We'll talk about some tricks for that as this goes on. But in this case, the cool thing for me is going to be a big epic showdown with a really powerful vampire. So, the program that I'm using to draw in is Map Tools. That's this here. Free program. Very dependent on the user's skill and proficiency with it. You can do everything from, drawing a black box to making something that looks more like this. This is a dungeon which I had prepped ahead of time for demonstrating a few things, including this. It's really just about how well you know how to use your assets and how good you are at the actual act of building the encounters, and the dungeon as a whole. But enough of me showboating with that. We're going to talk about... Oh, there's the wrong tool. Oops. Case in point. Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about assets, which are important for making things that aren't just black boxes, though that's what I'll be using for this, because I want to keep this simple and applicable to everyone. You don't need a huge resource library. As it turns out, all you need to make this work is Google, because you can Google any image you want, just about, and just drag it into Map Tools, and it'll show up. There's no upload it to a library or save it in a specific format, though some files will get picky and make you do things like that. By and large, you can just Google vampire, as I'm about to do. I can set this up to actually demonstrate it. I can Google vampire, click on an image, the first one I find, and unless things don't play nice with me, okay, they didn't, but hey, I get to demonstrate now, assuming that shows up in the stream, which it might not. But some images will give a series of errors, which just showed up, basically saying, hey, download this image. I'm not entirely sure why it happens. I think it has to do with things like file size and file type, but I will attempt to find one which I know works. There we go. I literally just drag and dropped. Some images are picky, the solution really is to right-click, save image as, save it to your desktop, throw it in from there. So, as I said, I'm going to be doing this as a super epic vampire dungeon castle type thing, you know, very Ravenloft, for those who are familiar with the old D&D modules, or Dracula, you know, that sort of gothic horror type thing. And there are a lot of questions that can be asked and answered in preparation for it. You know, who is this vampire? What is he doing here? How long has he had the castle? What kind of minions does he have? Stuff like that. I'm going to tackle them in a... I'm going to tackle those questions in a somewhat out of order method, mostly because I know the answer to all those questions already, so I'm going to present them in a format and sequence which assumes I know the former answers to kind of build up to it. So the first question which I'm going to answer is, who is this vampire? What is he doing here? Why is he here? Things of that nature. This is where a lot of people get caught up in, what do I call him, distant family lines. You don't need any of that to prep an encounter. Especially once we get to more non-diplomacy oriented encounters. You know, you can talk with a vampire, you can maybe persuade him not to fight. A skeleton, it doesn't really matter who that skeleton is. It's great if you can plug in that flavor, but if you get hung up there, you're never going to get the encounter done. And when you're actually building to run a game, you're on a time crunch. So, getting a dungeon built, getting the monsters in, and figuring out what the story of that place is, they have to come quick and hold themselves well together. So, this vampire is going to be the heir to a nation which the party is currently looking to annex. He was the rightful ruler until he became a vampire, was chased out, you know, monster things. They didn't want a vampire ruling their country. So he ran away and went dormant, waiting for a time when people would forget about him. But in his mind, he is the rightful king. And thanks in part to actions the party has undertaken, the most recent king is now dead. So our vampire friend has decided, I'm going to go return to my throne. But all of that really is background information, at least for the moment. What we have to ask now is, where's he been hiding? He's been hiding out. He hasn't had a desire to be found. And that means something like a castle or anything that would be prominent and obvious just isn't going to work. People presumably would have found him. Maybe he could have chased them off or things like that. But really, a deep, dark cave is a great place to hide. Sun's not going to get in. You don't really have to worry about it wearing down. And a lot of the time, they come with some of their own denizens to help protect it. We'll talk more about that once we get to actually putting monsters down and figuring out what we want in this encounter. But, in these encounters. But, at any rate, we now know who this guy is and what this dungeon's basic structure is going to be. So, now we're going to get to designing that. In Map Tools, there's a handy feature that I like to exploit, which allows me to change this grassy background into something else. Obviously, this is tailored to this specific tool, but under the Edit Map feature, one can turn it, you know, entirely black, or white, if it doesn't crash on me, which I think it might have. No, I just didn't click white. That is my fault. I may have broken this. At any rate, you can toggle the backgrounds. And it's not just limited to colors. If it'll let me demonstrate, you can do all sorts of things like a dark background, things like that. I tend to aim for more neutral and low-key colors, grays and browns and etc., because it leaves a lot for the players to put detail onto the map. You know, they see brown and dark, well, that's probably a cave. There's a grassy field, not so much. So in this case, I'm going to go with a straight grayish color and a darker gray. Gray obviously isn't the color of the ground, but it will help create the illusion that they're walking on stone, which is what I want. This isn't an earthy, dirty cave. It's stone deep in the earth, where he was sure no sun would get to. So once that's done, we start drawing rooms. These are the rooms encounters are going to take place and loot's going to be found, etc. There's a lot to be said about this topic, and there are a lot of people with differing opinions on it, but at the end of the day, there are some basic rules about encounters, which I'm going to go over. So I'm going to start by drawing a square, and I'm going to draw this square 30 by 30. That's 5 squares in one direction by 5 squares, or 6 squares in one direction by 6 squares in the other. Each square is 5 feet because in D&D, movement is handled in 5-foot increments. So when it comes to encounter design, one of the first things that has to be considered is how many people are realistically going to be in this encounter. Assuming a normal D&D game, you can expect 4 players, maybe more, maybe a few less, but you know, tailor it to your game. But for the average encounter, you're talking about 4 players. And then at least 1 monster, though 1 monster encounters don't really work. The players get more actions per turn, and a monster that wants to survive that has to be either so tough that other parts of the encounter get thrown out of whack, like how much damage it can deal, etc. Or it's just too weak and it gets beaten down before you get your rich narrative encounter. It's not to say 1 enemy encounters can't work, but they're not the standard. Usually, it's easiest to balance around at least as many players as the party. Which means you have 8 combatants on the battlefield if we're assuming the 4 players and 4 monsters. And that means that of this 30 by 30 square, 8 of those square, or 30 by 30, yeah, 30 by 30 square, 6 by 6 squares. We will have a total of 8 enemies. I'm just going to throw down generic tokens at this point to demonstrate. So our 4 elf tokens are the players, our heroic adventurers. The 4 golden helmeted ones are the enemies. Suddenly, with 8 less squares on the map, this is a very constricted, confined space. And maybe that's what's desired. It's good to know that that is a valid tool. But it also means that a lot of the time, especially when you're dealing with people with ranged and AoE spells, a 30 by 30 square isn't going to cut it. But there's another factor. Every player in Pathfinder doesn't really just take up 1 square. Even if they're only a medium-sized creature like these guys, where the figure only takes up 1 square, characters in Pathfinder threaten every square around them, meaning if someone goes running through that square, they can swing at them. So in reality, a room this size with this many people in it is basically impossible to navigate. It can be done, there are mechanics for moving around without provoking those attacks, but people are going to be stifled and staggered in their movement. It limits tactical options for movement. You can't really charge in a space like this. It's hard to get off spells because someone can just reach out and poke you mid-spell. So a 6 by 6 space doesn't really work for most encounters. Right side, what if we take it up? What if instead we do a 40 by 40? And of course we can shift these tokens around. There's the wrong tool. There we go. We can shift people into there. But again, that's not a whole lot of room. Better than before, and probably ideal for your standard, we're fighting skeletons or goblins or whatever, because, if the heroes come in through a door down here, and they'll often stack up like this, though it's bad practice, but, they come in, they're in roughly the starting area, and you scatter the enemies about. There's some room to move around. Pointedly, a room this size also means that a normal character whose movement speed is 30 feet has trouble, if they can at all, crossing all the way from one end of the room to the other. This is useful both for stopping players from just continually running down 15-foot long hallways from room to room to room and triggering a bunch of enemies, which you don't want. As fun as it might be, you're like, you triggered 3 fights at the same time. Don't do it. If the players do it on their own, that's great, but you want to make it difficult for them to do it. We'll talk more about why when we get into what monsters to select and that sort of thing, but it very quickly leads to parties dying. And pro tip, parties don't like dying. So, in a space like this, there's some room to move around. Players have some tactical options they can make. They can attempt flanking more readily and things like that. This is reasonable for a 4-person encounter with 4 monsters. But there are 2 other directions this can go. You could run into a situation where, say, instead of these 4 goblins they're fighting, one of them is an ogre. And he's a big guy. He takes up 4 times as many squares. And he threatens more squares around him. Suddenly, getting across this room isn't oh, I'd have to run and I might not be able to attack, or I have to charge, things like that. You can't get across that room without being swung at by him or one of his other friends. You come over here, you might be able to slip by, but you're only going to get to spaces like there before he takes a swing at you. And that's assuming they don't move or are positioned in a better way. The ogre, the large-sized creature, takes up a lot of space. The other way this can go is if, instead of a large creature, you've got a group of medium or smaller-sized creatures. They still take up 1 square, though their threatened range changes. But say you've got a 5th, 6th level party, guys who've got fireballs and lightning bolts. So you say, I'm going to use more enemies. More on that in a second, on why that's a good idea. But you're going to use more enemies. So you fill the space up with, say, twice as many enemies. Well, now the party has a lot more trouble moving around. In this particular layout, you've got that space down the middle. But, even if you move one guy there or there, well, again, we're back to they don't really have any ways to tactically maneuver. So, reasons you might want to do this. One, if you want to create that sense of, enemies are coming at us in droves, or it's hard to move around, or we're being overwhelmed. But, especially at later levels, players like feeling like they're really badass, like they've got all these powerful spells and they're just blowing people away. If you see the wizard took Fireball, let him use Fireball. Let him feel good using it. Talk more about specific ways to do that later. But reasons you might want to go with this, even though it means you might need a bigger space. In theory, we could use a space as big as we wanted, a massive 200-foot wide hallway or whatever. But in reality, we have to design according to certain principles that are consistent with the theme of the dungeon or encounter we're making. If you're making a castle designed for hill giants, the doors probably should not be 5 feet wide, because how would they get through them? I mean, they can, but it's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, and it's slow. We live in a world where doors are 6 feet tall-ish, because most people can get through that. Similarly, if you're designing a dungeon for kobolds, tiny little reptile guys, well, it might make sense that it's really hard to get around in there, because they only need like 4 feet of room to get through anywhere just fine. In the case of this vampire, though, at least broadly speaking, it's a cave. It's a cave he got through. Vampires have abilities that might make that easier in narrow spaces. And we've got some room to play around with larger spaces. But there shouldn't be any sort of, oh, this hallway is totally massive, or, oh, there's a 4,000-foot pit. It's just not called for. It creates dissonance between the player and the situation. Why is this way? Ideally, the player will never ask that question, or if they do, you have an answer for it and you're ready to give it. You never want to tailor solely to, well, it's this way because it makes the combat whatever. But sometimes that's the case, and it's about disguising that. Talk more about how to do that going on. But let's get into our first encounter. So I am blessed with a party of 7 characters that I have to build encounters for. So, in the above scenario, that means that our gold helmeted figures there, that's the size of the party. Wide rooms or rooms with more open layouts are important. Though at higher levels it becomes less of an issue because players can do things like teleport. But ultimately, they still need space. But space doesn't have to be just a 5-foot square. A space that an encounter happens, and if you want it to be, 8 by 8, can be done in other interesting ways. I'm going to use some of my resources to demonstrate this. Not at all necessary, it's just a little easier to visualize this way. So give me 1 second. I had to pull up my library because I was totally prepared for this. Right, and then I'm just going to use that token. So you ignore the name, ignore what it looks like. This is purely for demonstrating some numbers. So if we're going to make an 8 by 8 space, that's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'll go ahead and throw on the grid so that's easier to see. Where's the button? There it is. So now you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're going to go ahead and make this an 8 by 8 space. There's our 8 by 8 square. Now, squares are boring to have encounters in most of the time. But what you can do to preserve the amount of space you have, but make for more interesting choices, is to change the shape of the room, move it around. So for example, if I were to take this chunk out of the room, that creates an interesting hard corner that archers might be able to take advantage of with the spellcaster. An enemy could be waiting behind it, those sorts of things. But we still want to have that space. So the easiest thing I could do is throw it on there. And suddenly, I have a space for the players to enter from. And something that's slightly off from the encounter and presents it to them at a speed where they're not being ambushed every round. Because nobody likes, you walk into the room, you see 7 skeletons, roll initiative, they attack you. Players often like to be able to peek around a corner or through a doorway, and putting those doorways into your dungeon layout and accounting for them in the encounter space is helpful. That said, you can do other things with it. You could take this and do something like, we'll say something like that. Now, that looks a little rough and is not necessarily aesthetically pleasing, but now suddenly we have more nooks and crannies. You can maybe have paths branching off. It's a more interesting space to fight in than, oh, it's a plain, boring field with nothing in it. But even if you want to go the square route, there are ways to disguise that so that every room doesn't just kind of have janky angles and corners. One of the best ways I've found to do that is you take something like the dull, boring square room, and you ask, well, how does the ceiling stay up? Or what is in this room? Things of that nature. A lot of the time, something as simple as stone columns will suffice. So if I were to draw some stone columns in here, oh, I know what I'm wrong. So map tools can be a little picky about layers because it doesn't have many of them, but I will just put these on the bottom layer, and now you can see the drawings. So these probably won't be evenly spaced, but I do something like that, and you say, those are solid stone pillars, you can't shoot through them, you can look around them, but you can't see through them, things like that, and suddenly this isn't just a plain boring square. And if you want to get even more diverse with it, maybe you throw a big one in the center. That's off-center, but, something like that. Or you scatter them about, something like, Now, it might be worth asking, why'd they put the columns like that and things like that, which is where the other tool I use for sprucing up these kind of plain rooms comes in. And that's just area terrain. You could do something like broken columns where they used to be standing so that you don't have just a line after line of boring columns, or debris from previous battles, water hazards, those sorts of things. And all of that just makes for more interesting encounters. I can't charge through there because there's a bunch of rubble in the way. I'll slip and lose my footing. But my archer buddy, he can hide behind that half-cracked tombstone because it'll protect him from the enemy's arrows and spells, and then he can shoot back. Things like that. So, to review, broadly speaking, encounter spaces should be at least 6 by 6 if you've got a 4-person party. They shouldn't always be plain squares, though they shouldn't always be these non-symmetrical, weirdly shaped structures either. Ideally, every room should have an entrance and exit, and sometimes I will account for that separately from the encounter space. If I like the way a room is set up, or I just really need the space because I've got something in the middle that I want, I'll just throw 1 or 2 squares of space for them to enter from there. That becomes a little easier when you're building a whole dungeon, as we will in a bit, because then you're drawing the hallways anyway, so you just kind of get where these rooms connect. So, that all said and done, I'm going to talk now about some of the specific encounters, encounter formats, encounter designs that I like, because I'm going to be using some of them. By the way, hello to anyone who happens to be in the chat right now. I don't know if we have anyone, but I will look quick. Oh, hi Otaku! Anyway, so let's get to an actual designing an encounter. There are some templates I like because I've tested them frequently and found that they make for interesting choices players can be engaged, and I like kind of the thematic elements inherent to them. So we're going to start with this 8 by 8 square and ask ourselves, what can we do to spruce this up? So one of the methods that I've always enjoyed is to go ahead and just make a black square. Oh, that's the circle tool. And then throw in something in the middle, preferably more exciting than rubble and the like. I really like a pool of water. So I'm just going to quickly throw one of those in. So what we have here could be something like the villain's pet kraken, or crocodile, or insidious piranhas. There are a lot of things you can do with this sort of setup. It doesn't have to be water. It could be a pool of acid that, this is where he pulls the lever and the good guys fall. That's the start of the dungeon, perhaps. But the other thing that's really nice about this is that even if the water isn't an encounter, even if there's nothing in there, you've now limited the encounter space to this outside edge where players are going to want to be, without saying, no, you can't walk through the center. There's a force field, there's a hole. They can swim. Characters can swim. But it's going to slow them down. It's going to be less efficient, at a glance. Which means they have an interesting decision to make. Do I swim across the water? Will that net me an advantage that I need for this fight? Or is it better to stay on the outside? It's also handy for natural environments like these, because presumably anything living down here that's living, and it is a cave, so presumably it's not just the vampire, has to have water. Water is essential for most life, though in D&D that gets a little more flexible. So a pool of water can be a place for monsters to gather up and meet. It's a good place to put sigils, clues, riddles, things like that, because culture might well orient itself around here. And it works outside of traditional dungeons too. You can do something like the watering hole out on the plains. It doesn't have any rooms attached to it, but enemies are going to be gathered around your potential enemies, and you get to interact with them, and it makes sense for them to be there, whether it's the lion drinking water, or the bandits who are looking to mug anyone who comes looking for water out in the desert. In this case, though, we're going to go with just this, cavern, pool of water, and we'll come back to that when we actually build an encounter, but I'm going to talk about a few more of the templates I really like for designing encounters. So I'm going to scroll down and give us a slightly larger than normal room. I'm going to make it a 7 by 7, assuming I don't screw up actually doing that. Right, so 7 by 7 room. It's a black box at the moment, but this is how I like to bring multiple levels and three-dimensional combat in a way that's not terribly complicated. You don't have to do a ridiculous amount of complicated math, but it lets players feel like action heroes when they do things like scale up to the 2nd floor of the church and shoot arrows down from there. Or there's a tavern brawl and they get up in the rafters, things like that. So the way I do that is I just draw a box and I make it slightly larger than I need it to be, because the outside edge of it, which I will color in purple, is going to be this aforementioned balcony place, etc. If you've seen Lord of the Rings, think of the fight with the cave troll and how they've got that first balcony up there, where Legolas fights the orcs and things like that, while the rest of the fight is going on down below. This is perhaps a little small for that sort of engagement, but just as a general template, you've got the encounter down below, and then maybe a few archer enemies up top, or maybe the exits are upstairs and out the sides, and so the players need to make a fighting retreat to get up there and get out while something is attacking them down below. Or the inverse, they can be up top and see that they need to get down. Do they take the stairs, or do they risk the fall? I don't know that I'll necessarily be using this one for this encounter, or for this dungeon. Probably, but certainly not in this exact format. And then the third template, which I really enjoy for basic construction of this sort, I'm going to pull up from an example. If I can find the example. There it is. Alright, so up here we have, I'll get rid of that pop-up quickly. So what we have up here is a very typical temple culty ruins type thing. You know, the ancient cult has snuck their way deep into the jungle and is going to perform an ancient rite to wake up a demon or something of that sort. So this looks complicated at first, especially because of the tile elements and the many enemies, but I'm going to break it down. So the central point to all of this, of course, is the temple. The temple can be as nuanced or big as you want. It could be a whole dungeon into itself, but specific to one encounter, I've gone very simple with this. We have the temple altar type thing, and to communicate that this is a temple altar type thing, I've made a few measures that I consider important. The first is that I made an effort to, oh, thank you, Otaku. I made an effort to make this stand out. The rest of this place is kind of plain Jane terrain. You know, the tiles all look the same. Thanks. Really, though, thank you. Anyway, the tiles all look the same. They're relatively plain because I want the temple to stand out. And then to make the temple stand out, I designed it piece by piece. I knew I wanted kind of Aztec-y steps going up to it, because again, that harkens back to, at least for me, that very culty temple type thing. Ascend the stairs and that sort of thing. So to design the stairs, I simply took a tile which looked very stony and laid it out. So let me get some of these superfluous elements out of the way. So the way I did that is I laid down the stone tiles, which are these gray squares here, and then I drew a line around the sides and front of that staircase, because that outlines that it's separate and slightly risen from the lower normal terrain. The tools for doing this will be different from program to program, but at the end of the day, I'm basically beveling these stairs, which, as Otaku showed me, thank you, Otaku, it is much easier in some other programs, but that's basically what I did there. And then I did the same on the second floor, or the second tier, and up again on the third with this kind of fewer and fewer stairs pattern. I find that you can lay this out infinitely. You know, it can be 10 and then 8 and then 6, though odd numbers work better, 7, 5, 3, that sort of thing, because then it ends with 1, that one tile there. So once you know you kind of laid out the steps, then the next important thing is to draw people's eyes, or the player's eyes, to this place. You know, it's one thing for it to look nice, but amid a bunch of enemies, it might not stand out, which is why I made use of these symbols, these ones here, all pointing inward, because there are certain things about human biology and the way our eyes work, as though those were two different things, that mean our eyes are going to be drawn there. It also works because I needed like culty runes and things to tell you, this is a bad god, you don't want them to finish whatever it is they're doing. So it's all pointing toward this space here, this uppermost level, which I made an effort to make stand out, again, by using a different colored tile, and in this case, 2 separate colored tiles, because if I took this and just laid it across there, it might stand out, but it doesn't stand out as well as, did I miss one? I don't know, as well as something like this does. I think that's how it was before, but something to that layout. There are other reasons I chose to use the green as far as specific to the campaign that this will be used for, but again, the idea is drawing the eye there. Because then, even if the players aren't told anything, if they just stumble on this encounter, if you just throw it at them as a random encounter, they already understand something of what's going on without me having to say a word. How do I want to tackle the encounter side of this best? We can talk a little bit, I suppose, about what's going on here in terms of what monsters I chose, why, etc. And this is as good a place as any. So let me just reset the map quickly. Alright, so going along with this theme of the cult doing the ritual thing, one of the key elements is our cultists, from a purely narrative standpoint first. Those are those guys. And they are the victory condition for the players, at least in theory. If they die, they die. The players, that is. But in theory, they stop the ritual, they've won. And to help communicate what these people are, and to make it less video gamey, because players often don't like being told, here is your objective, don't do anything else. I've also included 2 more of these cultist orcs over here who will cast spells and things like that, and they are in fact the most dangerous people in this encounter. That helps communicate to the players to the player's brain, and then to the characters as well, these are the bad guys. These are the real problem. Beyond that, narratively, we have a bunch of mooks, fanatics, loyal followers, dominated people who are helping to protect it. They want to see the ritual succeed, whatever. Talk more about why they're there mechanically in a second. Same with the 3 big dumb hill giants. So, in this encounter, the players are coming in from over here. That's why they have this open space, and if I'm not mistaken, 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 4 spaces there that are readily accessible that no one can immediately attack them in. Someone has to move to reach them. Now, that won't work again for like the 7-person party, but I did that deliberately, so that the players can all line up there and survey the situation. We'll talk about the mechanics of what monsters, etc. in a second, but what's more important here on a fundamental level, down at the middle, is that there are many enemies here, and with the exception of the cultists, basically none of them are threatening to the party. They're dangerous enough that the party can't just ignore them and walk through them, but no one of them is going to meaningfully hurt the party. Using Alzin here, who is one of the characters from that the 7-person game, he has 62 hit points. Each of these regular orcs, not counting the hill giants or the cultists, hits for a d6 plus 1. Now, that means their maximum damage is 7, which is slightly over 1/10 of his hit points. They can hit pretty reliably, but they're not realistically going to kill a party member in one round. More on action economy in a second. I know I keep saying things like that, but the important thing to highlight here is that it is okay for your monsters to not be deadly to the players. In fact, most of the time, that's what you want. So, what role are the monsters serving? Aside from the aforementioned narrative role, they're slowing the players down. Not because I don't want the players to succeed in stopping the ritual, but because it's important that the ritual has time to gestate, to communicate to the players what's going on. Again, going back to that, 1 monster encounters don't really work. If I took everything off the map but those 2 cultists, or even all 4 cultists, well, the encounter's really straightforward, then the players don't have to make a whole lot of choices. Go up there, kill the cultists. Here, they're going to have to fight their way through all these fanatical enemies who want to stop them, but ultimately probably can't. They can only buy time. And to that end, I've also employed the use of larger creatures, because as you might notice, this battle space is 55 feet wide, or 11 squares, by 45 feet wide, or 9 squares if I haven't failed basic math. So it's large, but there are a lot of enemies here, because I want the players to feel like they're hacking and slashing their way through. But just throwing a bunch of enemies is tedious to run. Turns take a long time, and again, most of these enemies aren't terribly effectual, so having to sit there for an hour while 20 enemies swing at you and don't do a whole lot isn't fun. So to highlight the danger here and the fact that this isn't just something they can walk through, literally, I made use of 3 large-sized creatures, and pointedly, I put 2 of them in places that prevent the party from immediately just running up here, climbing up on top of the altar, and killing the bad guys. They can, of course, still try to do that. I didn't put walls up there and say, no, you're not allowed. A savvy player might look at this map and go, hold on, I don't have to fight these guys. I have to get past him. And in some ways that falls back on the 1 monster encounter design, but now the players feel like they earned it, at least in theory. They feel like I outsmarted them. I figured out where the weakness in their defenses was. And because I've accounted for that, I can plan around it. I can assume they might try that. One of the ways which I went about that is by making this space here 1 square. If the players play their cards right, they might all be able to move down there quickly, but more likely, even if they kill the hill giant, one player is going to end up like here, and it's going to be difficult depending on how... some GMs will say players can't move through each other's squares, some will say they can, but ultimately that looks problematic for players to just run down. They can't all run down to, say, these two squares and climb in all at once, because only two players can occupy those squares at a time. So it's not a place they want to get bottlenecked, especially if there are enemy spellcasters who can do things like throw fireballs at them or lightning bolts. They don't want to get caught up without having meat shields between them, or civilians, enemies, to hide behind, which is another reason why we have so many enemies. It limits the caster's ability to throw big area effect spells unless they're willing to kill their allies, and maybe they are. Maybe that's how, in this instance, I decide to run it. But then that plays as much in the player's favor and communicates these orcs, they have no regard for each other. They are insane or savage or zealous. Similarly, I put the hill giant over here to block that path if the players tried to cut around. Though I made a point to not put him there, both because all of this is 2 spaces wide, so the map is inherently not symmetrical, which was important for the kind of reasons we talked about, not having square boxes, and because then the monster layout isn't symmetrical. Is it better to run up there and to fight him, 2 guys against the ogre, perhaps? Can you maybe shortcut up here? Is it worth cutting through the enemies? Because if this ogre is here, and this space is 1 square wide, like over here, then it's not worth it to come over here, because they're facing the same problem here as they do here, but they had to go through more enemies to do it, at least in theory. So, I put him up there. Second, drink. Alright, so, I'm glad you are otaku. This is stuff that's not intuitive at all, and I don't see many people talking about it. So, this is one of those things that I think I bring to this conversation, just from years and years of playing around with this. I've been using this format in general, the monster placement aside, but the theme of it for as long as I've been running, or close to, and been tweaking it and playing with it since then. And I think this is the format I like best for it. So then, let's go back. Thank you. I think I have it set to record a VOD, and I'm pretty sure I told it to... Yeah, it is recording as well right now to my computer. So assuming I don't break my hard drive, and I shouldn't, it's more than a terabyte, this will go up on YouTube. Thank you. Alright, so those are kind of the 3 basic templates I really like. I only really think one of them is appropriate to what I'm building here, at least in the broadest sense, just copy-pasting it in. But now that we've answered what kinds of basic encounters can be run, what does encounter design look like, what are some things that have to be considered, we can start talking about, what is in this cave, what do some of these rooms look like, and things like that. So, in the specific campaign I'm running, we haven't dealt with caves at all yet. A lot of the time, players find out there's a lot of goblins in this area, and they expect goblins in every fight. And there's nothing wrong with that. We'll talk about what kind of design that is. It's called iterative design, or Mega Man design, in a second. But it boils down to when players don't have expectations about what they're about to face, it's good to fall back on typical standards, or what seems sensible. There's a separate school of thought that says, oh, throw in whatever you want, don't have to explain it. I don't like that, at least for most situations. If they're going into like some Fey Lord's wacky funhouse, then sure, he might have a menagerie of monsters. But really, you want monsters that make sense and would cohabitate. you know, that you could reasonably find where you're going. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this second template, or the second encounter template, and make use of this first one. So, as I mentioned before, this is kind of the pool of water with a narrow walkway around it, jagged, rough-hewn stone, that sort of thing. And to me, when I think monsters in caves that go along with our theme of, you know, the hidden vampire lord and secrets, I think things like troglodytes, darrow, drow, though I don't like using drow as much, but that's a specific quirk of mine. Ultimately, these deep-dwelling creatures that know things. And in Pathfinder in particular, a lot of those types of races speak an ancient language called Aklo. Name isn't important. What matters is it's a language not many people speak, and it's tied to the setting's history. It's an ancient language that players might have picked up or might be familiar with. Or if I say, hey, the runes on the walls are written in Aklo, or the creatures speak in Aklo, then I can say, and that's the language of the Aslanti people from 10,000 years ago, or something like that. And that applies to, like, your own personal world building as well. You just have to seed it, whereas in what I'm running, a pre-existing setting, those sorts of things are already written into the system. So I intend to make full use of them. Though, anytime I reference Aklo or these sorts of things, just plug in your own thing. You know, maybe in your world, the ancient secret language is Gnomish. I've seen that before, and I thought it was hilarious. We're going to go with this basic layout, but I'm going to go ahead and give it an entryway. I'm not going to do quite what you did, Otaku, in yours where, you know, there might be an encounter out there or something like that. This is pretty much purely a space to justify the players going in. So, typically, or what looks most aesthetically pleasing is this kind of one-by-one... Oh, hello, Katie. Glad to see you made it. This 1-by-3 entryway, or however long it needs to be, because that looks nice aesthetically. You know, it's right in the center, it leads out, that sort of thing. But particularly for a cave entrance, I don't like that at all. I mean, a cave entrance might be 5-by-5, but it's certainly not going to be clean and smoothly 5-by-5. So I try to make it at least a 10-by-10 chunk, or 10-by-10, 2-by-5. 2-by-3, you know what I mean. And I'm going to color them different colors here to help things stand out, though I don't advise actually making a rainbow-colored map, for the same reason you don't just throw monsters in. It throws players off. It makes immersion more difficult. But for our purposes, purple is the entrance. So the players are going to file their way in, and what do I want in this room? Well, what things have I decided to live here? We talked about some of the examples, and in this case, I'm going to go with troglodytes. And the reason I'm going to do that is because troglodytes are relatively numerous. They're evil, which is important for a reason I'll go over in just a moment. And they're low CR. They're easy to fight, which plays into the numerous thing, because then you can have lots of them and tell some stories about, you know, this is the tribe that lives down there, etc. But it's important that enemies are evil, because even if you've got a party that doesn't have a paladin or a cleric or someone who's really uptight about their morality, the moment you start throwing in moral quandaries like, do you kill the orc baby, is it really evil? You slow down the game, you can kill your game, but more importantly, it becomes the focus of what's going on. Nobody cares about the strange cult writings on the walls, because they're arguing with each other about ethics and morality in a world where, in Pathfinder, those are pretty hard-cast things. So, just to avoid it, evil enemies. Not every enemy has to be evil, but they should at least be doing something the players want to oppose. Yeah, I've had to just flat out say, look guys, we'll deal with it later, let's keep playing, and even then, it's affected the way players are thinking about it, they're unhappy, there really isn't a good solution. But I'm going to throw some troglodytes in here. So, once again, I just Google troglodyte. If I want a specific art style or to adhere to a specific art style for my creatures, I'll often throw Pathfinder on the end of it, because then I know I'm getting stuff from the same artist or same general art style. So we're going to go ahead and throw in some troglodytes. I've chosen this image for them, and again, it's as simple as just dragging it in there. Oftentimes you'll have to rename it, because it'll come up with whatever it's named on the server you're dragging it from. But at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. And I'm going to seed, given our space restrictions and what we're shooting for here, I'm going to seed a fair amount of them in. So I'm going to put at least one on every side of this square, for reasons we talked about before, with ensuring players don't have easy and readily apparent lines of movement that stop them from thinking about other possible ones. And then I'm going to put 2 more in the water. There's some math behind this that we'll go over in a second, but the important thing here is that if they decide to take the water, it shouldn't feel like an automatic loss. It shouldn't feel like, oh, I'm just screwed, this was the wrong decision. But you don't want it to be simple either. And in Pathfinder and other systems like it, the active I roll a swim check is, thank you. You know, that gets boring. I roll a swim check, I roll a swim check. It takes like 3 turns. Give them something to do. They can still try that swim check while they're fighting. Or, you know, while they're like, hey, throw me a rope, get me across. Those sorts of things. So, now we get into the math of this. And under normal circumstances, I'd probably just link the math in the text. But hey, I'm making a video, and I don't have a stream chat overlay. So I'm just going to talk about it. So, in Pathfinder, monsters have a CR, and anyone who's played D&D back to exactly Otaku, anyone who's played D&D as far back as at least 2nd edition knows broadly what CR is, but it's the difficulty of an encounter, or at least a monster. But the second most commonly well-known thing about CR is that it doesn't usually work. 2 monsters of the same CR can have radically different lethal potentials. That said, there is kind of a quick hack to that, a shortcut which is fairly reliable. And that is that in Pathfinder, monsters of a given CR have the same, they give the same amount of experience. And you can then go, well, how much experience does this give? And divide it by your number of players. And there's a rough guideline for about how much EXP players can handle at a given level, or how many EXP of monsters. I think 5e even has a similar system to this. For your average encounter, the math doesn't matter, because you're using a CR2 monster per CR2 player, or level 2 player. Those aren't the same thing, but that's generally how it works out. You don't need the math at the point, 2 and 2. But where it comes in handy is if you go, well, I have a 5th level party. How many CR2 monsters can I use against them? There's a slower way to do the math, but ultimately, this shortcuts it. Like I said, this is a shortcut. It's not that CR is good, but if you're going to adhere to that system, and I recommend you do starting out, this is how you do it. Is there a good way to go about this? Basically, the table for how much EXP a player can handle for a given difficulty, or what dictates what that difficulty is, scales at a rate, I can't think of the word if it's linear or exponential, but suffice to say, if you Google GM's Guide to Creating Challenging Encounters, you can find the table and a lot of other literature on this subject. I'll link it for the folks in the chat, but like I said, if you just Google GM's Guide to Creating Challenging Encounters, it'll be there. When I put this up on YouTube, I'll probably link it in the description as well, because if I just say the information, it's not going to stick the same as if I threw a table up, which if I thought about it, I would have done. But the point here is you can use this to roughly estimate CR. So in the case of these troglodytes, if we go to the troglodyte page on the Pathfinder SRD, we will see that they are CR1 monsters. Each CR1 monster gives 400 experience, which means for an encounter which is of average difficulty, an encounter which isn't going to kill the players but feels worth doing, a 5th level party can handle roughly 1 troglodyte apiece. Maybe a little more than that, but we're going to err on the safe side here. It's the first encounter of the dungeon, which is advice I generally recommend. Players don't like going in cold to an incredibly lethal situation. They like a little bit of warning, they like a sense of scaling danger. Hi, Fluffy Wuffy, glad to see you made it. We are discussing encounter design and some of the finicky, nuancy, mechanical bits that go into that. This will go up on YouTube if you want to catch the bits that you missed, but we'll press on otherwise. So, roughly 1 per player. And if I'm building this for a 7-person party, 6 isn't going to quite cut it. It's not 7, and they're not 5th level players. They're twice that. I don't actually know how to change the stream name, I'll be honest. Note to self, get chat overlay for next time. But someone recommended changing the stream name to Encounter Design. I wasn't sure how to. Top right, then click Manage. Pathfinder, Encounter Design. Has that changed it? Yeah. Hello, Wesley Wolf. Pleasure to see you. I think I did, but I will double check. Yeah, I clicked save. Oh, I know what I'm doing. I'm trying to type it in the game you're streaming, not the stream title. Great job, Austin. There we go. Alright, now it's changed. So, hello folks. We're designing D&D encounters. Glad to hear you're doing well, Wesley. Are you from Otaku or who else hosted me? I think it was just Otaku. Are you from Otaku stream or did you stumble in? Alright. Yeah, Fluffy, I had a guy in my last campaign who had a similar problem. Alright, so, sorry YouTube folks. Anyway, the party I'm actually building this for isn't 5th level, but we'll handle that in a second. I'm going slightly below the number of creatures because I want this to feel like an introduction, not, oh, we've jumped into a fight that's actually going to be kind of rough right off the bat. Alright, so we've got 6 of them, and I'm taking into account the fact that this water here is probably going to make the encounter at least a little more difficult for some of the party. They move slower through it than the troglodytes might. They might get stuck in it, they might fail a swim check, things like that. So I'm playing it safe on that front, and I typically recommend that. But now we have our 6 troglodytes, and yeah, I don't mind that at all, Fluffy. I think I put out an ad in Grimmeth's Discord a while back for exactly that sort of thing. I don't know if you saw it or time zones just didn't work out, but I'm always open to it. It's just a matter of finding time. Alright, so a 10th level party can handle roughly 2,400 experience worth of enemies in a more than reasonable fight, in a fight that they should win. But as we can see here, we only have 400 EXP per troglodyte, 6 troglodytes. Unless I've missed my math, that's only 2400 EXP. That's 1/7 of what we can fill this room with. Now, I could fill it with 6 times as many troglodytes, but then there'd be no room for the players. It would just be a room full of troglodytes. Not that exciting. So what we're going to do here, first and foremost, is consider, are these troglodytes by themselves a threat to the players? And the answer is no. They're not going to hit the players. They can't roll high enough to meaningfully do it. They might interfere with movement, which is why we put some of the guys on the outside, but one hit, they're going to drop. They're never going to threaten the players. The players could basically ignore them. So we have 2 ways we can deal with that. The first is to stat them up, give them class levels, boost their attack rolls, things like that. There's some finicky nuance to that. You know, how much is worth what CR, that sort of thing. But I'm not going to go that route here because I think that deserves a video in and of itself, if not several. Fortunately, on the SRD, the game provides examples of stronger troglodytes and the things that they can do. And in this case, I'm going to use the troglodyte paragon. I'm choosing to use that because narratively, troglodyte paragons are ancient, old troglodytes who've retreated into the deep places of the world and have been hiding out. They're often hundreds of years old and incredibly paranoid, which means when the players come through, they're not going to be able to talk their way through this encounter, at least not likely. I don't like having opening encounters that the players can talk through, because the point is to get them warmed up and getting a feel for how tough they can expect this dungeon to be. So, having xenophobic, paranoid enemies who are somewhat threatening is a reasonable choice. So, CR5 enemies, regardless of what they are, give the same experience. And each CR5 monster gives 1600 experience. So if we pull out our calculator, 7 10th level characters, if we get 2400 EXP per player, comes out to a total of 16,800 EXP. That's about what we can put in this encounter. So we're then going to go ahead and take the 1600 EXP from the troglodytes and times it by 6. We've accounted for 9600 of the EXP. Now, are CR5 troglodytes any more likely to threaten the players than CR1 ones? CR1 troglodytes? Not inherently, but one of the things high-level troglodytes like that can do, specifically the troglodyte paragons, the reason I chose them in specific, is because they get certain spells and spell-like abilities that I think will be useful for manipulating the party's actions, because we don't want the party to just run through, everyone swings all their spells, and it's not a fight because they beat the enemy down. They can do things like, hypothetically, create walls of stone to block people's paths, dominate enemy players to turn them on their allies, those sorts of things. And in this case, I'm going to give them access to one of these spell-like abilities, Speak with Animals, which allows them to communicate with dinosaurs and reptiles, because troglodytes are these lizardy folk that are in close communion with other reptiles. So I'm going to use reptiles to fill out the other, whatever 16,800 minus 9,600 is, which I think is 9,600. Nope, 7,200. All right, so we have 7,200 EXP worth of reptiles to play with. We have to ask, what kind of reptiles live in a cave like this, particularly in this area with water and things like that, and why do the troglodytes keep them around? Is it just for friendship? Those sorts of things. And the creature I am going to go with, I think, is something like a reptilian salamander, not the outsider planar creature salamander, but the water-dwelling amphibian, which in Pathfinder I can say, it's still a reptile. It's fine. So I'll go ahead and pull up, a salamander image to just plug in there. And ultimately, the actual image isn't terribly important, but there's a degree of wanting to communicate what this creature does to the players. If you have a picture of a creature breathing fire, it should probably breathe fire, as opposed to breathing ice or whatever. So in this case, I'm going to make use of this image because I think what the troglodytes are going to make use of the salamander for, if I can spell salamander, is things like providing heat, maybe light, though troglodytes don't like it. They might milk it, as Fluffy Woofy at least tangentially suggested. They might ride it. It might protect them. It is a little gross, but the more you can communicate to your players that these things are strange and alien, the better, because it creates an us versus them mentality, which helps that whole alignment thing. Also, yes, it might just be something they slaughter. In this case, I'm going to make it a large creature. Talk a little bit more about the specifics of what it is in a second, but I want it to be a large creature because whatever it is, I want it to be the focus of this encounter. I want it to be the single boss monster amid the mobs, if you will. And maybe that defeats the role of it being a basic meat source or something like that, but exactly, Otake, it is the main threat. But there are other things they could be using it for. It could be protecting them. It could be their god, which is probably the angle I'll end up taking, but at any rate. So I'm going to use a salamander, and unfortunately, as far as I know, salamanders aren't necessarily statted in Pathfinder. There are salamanders, but they're extraplanar fire creatures. They're not what I'm looking for. So I have a few options I can take. I can paste another monster onto this and say, oh, it's a salamander, but here's what it mechanically is. Or I can take the route of building a monster. I'm probably not going to take the building a monster route because there's a lot that goes into that, and it's certainly that should be saved, in my opinion, for either boss monsters like at the end of a dungeon, something you want to specifically tailor, or something where there just isn't a working prototype to build off of in a more simple fashion. You can, make every monster unique, give it class levels, whatever, but the screen time of a monster, for the most part, is 5 rounds of combat. A whole session if you're lucky. Usually not worth going to the effort. Yeah, exactly. One of the things I do along those lines, just to diversify things, is I roll every monster's hit points, or every type of monster's hit points, instead of just taking the average, because then the players go, oh, I swung at it and it took, I did 18 damage and it died. The next one takes 18 damage and it doesn't die. They start considering things. Now, most of my players know it's because I roll it, but sometimes it's because they took an extra feat, or this one has class levels. It stops it again from feeling like a video game. Thank you. So in this case, the options I have to go with meaningfully for what I want this creature to do required to be in the water, which is where I primarily want it, with some options for reaching out to land. And for that, what I'm going to do is just paste the anaconda, or the giant anaconda rather, onto this monster. Mechanically, it's an anaconda. It does everything an anaconda does. It can coil, in this case with its tail, it can bite, things like that. It won't claw because anacondas don't have claws. And if the players really want to ask why it's not clawing, it didn't feel like it. This is a trick I don't recommend using all of the time, because, well, at that point, does it really matter what stat block you use? You know, you use goblins for everything at level 1, players are going to notice. Or everything has the same spell like it does. Exactly, because shut up, that's why. I'm fine with being asked questions, especially after the session, but in the moment, I don't want players to be wondering that, which is why I'm sticking this in the water. Now, the giant anaconda is normally a CR 10 monster, which gives 9,600 experience, as much as the whole rest of this encounter, and slightly more than where we want it to be. So what I'm going to do, or the reason I'm still using the anaconda, is because I'm going to restrict it to just being in the water. Maybe that's not a huge restriction, maybe that shouldn't lower the creature's CR, but in this case I feel like it will. I have players who are nimble and quick. They're going to be able to play around that and probably avoid getting in the water. So I'm going to stick it in the water and restrict it to there and say that that makes it a CR lower. I'm not doing that just arbitrarily, but I realize it looks that way. That's something I'm intuiting, and I might be wrong about it. That might not be enough to justify it. But that's why we're playing it safe with the troglodytes, because if I'm off by 1 CR, this is still a pretty average encounter for a party of this size and scale. That said, now that I've stuck the anaconda in the water, we go back to that. We don't want the players to feel like they've lost if they go in the water. So I'm probably going to move the troglodytes out of the water. I might stick them, you know, there and there, and suddenly the water looks really appealing, because the troglodytes don't have reach weapons. As far as the players can tell, they're not meaningfully spellcasters. I might do something to hint at the fact that they have magic, or maybe clue them in before they come to the dungeon, but they're certainly not going to be throwing fireballs or anything like that. So the players might say, yeah, let's just get in the water and shoot them with spells, bows, etc. And at which point, the encounter's not automatically over, because the salamander is there. That said, one of the things we have to talk about for this particular template is how to know when an encounter is over. Lots of GMs will run this encounter until everything in the room that isn't a player is dead. Broadly speaking, that is the wrong way to go about this. I don't necessarily like calling things wrong when it comes to design, but in this case, it is. Because if the salamander and most of the troglodytes are dead, it's not worth the extra 10 minutes to kill the last one. You can narrate, you know, do you guys want to kill all the troglodytes, or do you want to capture one alive? They say we want to kill them, right? You know, when there's only 1 or 2 left, you ask that. Yeah, they run away, or you say, yeah, you know, you climb out of the water and skewer the last troglodyte as he tries to get away. Don't need to make any rolls, he's dead anyway. And it makes, again, the players feel better than they normally do. We routed them so bad we didn't even have to finish the fight. There's a time and place for that. Sometimes you want to let the encounter run on as long as possible because the encounter is still challenging. Like if the salamander's still alive and all the lizards are, or all the troglodytes aren't, and someone's in the water. You don't just say, oh, the salamander's dead. Or because the party is still expending resources. And this gets into one of the primary reasons you don't just have, you walk into the dungeon and there's the boss. Yes, exactly. You want the players expending resources because that impacts what their effective CRs, what kind of enemies they can reasonably face. A party who's just rested, they're at full hit points, they've got all their spells, their CR is pretty easy to calculate. But when the wizard's out of fireballs and lightning bolts and magic missiles, well, he's a lot less effective, usually. And that means that more and more, like this fight here, if I put it in the next room, from purely like how hard is it for the players, not necessarily how interesting or etc., it's a harder fight. Because if I've done my job right, they have fewer resources, people are hurt, characters are running low on spells and abilities and things like that. So, that is the primary role these kinds of encounters serve. You don't want them to kill the party, you don't even necessarily want them to threaten the party, but you want it to be enough of a threat that the players don't just go, hey, swordsman, deal with that, and don't ever get hit, and we'll be fine. I'm going drink. Alright, I think I'm going to take a brief break here to run to the bathroom, pause the stream, because then I'll just restart it and I won't have to do as much editing when this gets uploaded to YouTube. But I'll be back in like 2 minutes. Be right back, folks.